Welcome, everyone. My name is Brigadier General Retired Chris Stockel. I'm a Vice President with the Civil Affairs Association, and I've been fortunate enough to work for General Retired Vince Brooks a couple times in my life. So on behalf of the Civil Affairs Association, I welcome General Brooks. In his previous jobs, he was the Combined Forces Commander, the United Nations Commander, and the U.S. Forces Korea Commander, along with several other unique roles he had in Korea. Previous to that, he was the Army Pacific Commander, and previous to that, the 3rd Army ARCENT Commander. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to General Retired Vince Brooks. Hello, sir. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for doing this.
Well, thank you, General Chris. It's good to see you once again, and thanks so much for inviting me to talk to the Civil Affairs Association today. And I did look through the attendees very quickly, and first, I'm delighted that you've got a good turnout. I see 65 attendees plus us as panelists, and among them are many people I know and served with, and in many cases, people who taught me, as you did, about the importance of civil affairs. I have to say that I didn't need a whole lot of persuasion on it, but what you gave me was a lot more depth, because I was already a believer in what civil affairs is, does, can be. And so to all of you, know that you're hearing from a true believer today. And I have to acknowledge that not all of my colleagues with whom I served or who succeeded me in various commands out there, the ones who are still serving, not all see it the same way, because we all are products of our experiences. My experiences with civil affairs have all been positive. And I began with exposure to civil affairs as a brigade commander in Kosovo back in the year 2001. We had civil affairs associated with the task force that we had. The Multinational Brigade East was its official title. That was the American contingent that was responsible for the eastern side of Kosovo from its center out to the east. And many areas that required development, restoration, reconstruction, establishment of civil society in good order. And it was an environment that was a really good laboratory for me. You know, I was a colonel as a brigade commander, but also the deputy commander of that multinational brigade. And so I had oversight of our civil affairs efforts in a large portion of that region. And I can tell you the things that began to make a difference in the lives of people, the affected Kosovar Albanians, the affected ethnic Serbian Albanians, excuse me, the ethnic Serb Kosovars. Those two different factions had been at war with one another and sadly had destroyed each other's livelihood, as war does. And now it's time to try to get the country back on its feet and move them to a more stable future, less filled with conflict and violence, and where people's livelihoods can be restored. And that's everything from rebuilding houses to farms to water and sewage systems to electrical grids to rebuilding monasteries that had been destroyed or mosques that had been destroyed through combat action. Okay, so we saw it all right there. And in the midst of an insurgency, externally supported. So there were many players on the field there, not just the ethnic Serbs and ethnic Albanians, but rather the Kosovo force, the United Nations mission in Kosovo. All these structures were added to try to put the country back on its feet. The civil affairs played a critical role in that, and I got to see the impact that civil affairs units, small units, especially when coupled with conventional units, territory holders, if you will, people who are responsible for securing an area. Civil affairs can work inside of those areas in such a way that effects begin to manifest, where people who have been impacted by war can begin to have some degree of hope. Well, I saw that there, and I got to see it again in multiple places. As we were planning, I was the planner at ARCENT as a colonel, and we were planning for what might happen if there was a resumption of hostilities against Iraq. and that indeed did come in 2003, but civil affairs plans were already embedded inside of that. Those became manifested in 2003 as we invaded Iraq, and we were already engaged in action in Afghanistan at that point in time. Civil affairs was already playing a role from the very beginning. Some of the civil affairs associated with special operations units, but the big impacts come from the civil affairs commands, who then begin to put out civil affairs planning teams, civil affairs headquarters of various levels that then augment the thinking of operators like me, so that there is something that's being done to impact the lives of people. The idea of keeping civilians out of the way of war is an old view of civil affairs. That really is not the modern view, and candidly is not the most important view. The restoration of normalcy after the effects of war is the role of civil affairs. And the United States is uniquely structured with these commands. I'm very grateful that we have them. And we can have a discussion about componency and whether they're in the right places or not. And I'll allude to that here in just a moment. And I'm sure we'll get into that as we get into the discussion. But the fact that we have these structures, the CA commands, that's really important depth in the US bench, and is often overlooked, candidly, as we start thinking about force structure and force management levels and how many people you can put in the country at a given point in time. People start looking to cut or to discard things that they believe to be superfluous. And any commander who thinks that civil affairs is superfluous is making a grave mistake, because it's through civil affairs that we create conditions of stability. The last thing I'd say is the US military, and particularly the US Army, which has the majority of the civil affairs structure, is uniquely positioned to impact environments in the continuum of war, especially in competition. We can see that through the entire continuum, from competition that happens at the beginning, the effort to prevent war, to undergird regions that might be vulnerable to instability. That can be done. And certainly in the Middle East and in the Pacific, my two theater commands, we were actively committing civil affairs units and capabilities. Now, we couldn't draw deeply into the well because of the componency issue. The majority of them were in the Army Reserve. And there had to be a limit to how much we could actually draw on at a given point in time. I wanted more always, but could not physically commit anything more than CAPT, civil affairs planning teams, in most places. But it was helpful. It made a difference in each one of those places. And honestly, the alignment that we sought and succeeded in gaining of combatant command authority over the 351st Civil Affairs Command, where that combatant command authority went to the Indo-Pacific Command Commander, and then administratively controlled and in limited conditions, operationally controlled by the US Army Pacific Commander, while the prime ADCON, the prime administrative control of creating the force, generating the force, maintaining its readiness, fell to Civil Affairs Command under the United States Army Reserve Command. So we had this interesting hybrid structure that was unique in the world because there were no other civil affairs commands that were under combatant command authority. They could be committed for mission, like we certainly saw the 352nd committed throughout the CENTCOM AOR when I was there, but they didn't have a COCOM authority except for the part that was committed. What was unique in this case in the Pacific was we had COCOM over the entirety of the command continuously. And that meant that we could farm out planning work to the Civil Affairs Command headquarters. And in that, we achieved a considerable leverage that would otherwise not have been achieved until after mobilization. If you're going to be working on something and generating practice and readiness exercises, why not work on something that's actually going to make a difference? And that's what we found out of the 351st. So componency matters. The AC pieces, the alignment with special operations, the big reserve structure that is principally to be used for conventional force application. We've got to think our way through that. I don't think we have it right at the present time. There's more that the 351st wanted to do and could have done in disaster relief in the Indo-Pacific area. And I think particularly in the Philippines and in Kathmandu, Nepal, when the natural disasters hit the two of those during my time there. We were able to get a planning team forward, and we were also able to get the headquarters in Mountain View committed to generating some depth and helping us think through at the forward end where the Joint Task Force was operating. But it would have been much better to have a structure inside of the Joint Task Force forward that traced all the way back to the Combatant Command and the Civil Affairs Command. That would have been a better design, but we couldn't quite get that deep. So we're not postured right. We're not postured for competition. And that's a problem, because as we think about great power competition and the effort to prevent war, particularly with China, if we're not actively engaged in all aspects of the military instrument being used as part of our smart and hard and soft power, then we're leaving players off of the field, and we're not going to win in the competition that we have. And this is particularly so when China, having a different configuration, can send out its smart power and soft power into countries where it's seeking influence, and it is fundamentally linked back to the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party. So they can commit their soft and smart arms with much greater ease than the United States can. We're going to lose the contest if we don't figure out this configuration. So I want to leave on that point. That's not a negative, that's a stimulus point. And now let's have a conversation a little bit more deeply about what you want to talk about.
Great, sir. Thanks. Hey, so sir, you talked about USARPAC and your Korea time, access to the KCOM that was out there, and you were the first general officer to. There's these. I'm sure anyone that's had anything to do with Korea understands the importance of the rehearsal of concept drills that happen. And you went with, I think we should talk more about stability. That seems to have caught us, unfortunately, by surprise in the past. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? And then the contributions the 351 was able to make with their tabletop exercises. And it seemed to me like the Korean civilians and the Korean military were the ones exchanging business cards at some of those tabletops, because the U.S. military and the U.S. civilians knew each other. We knew our counterparts. So I don't think we're going anywhere alone in the future. So can you talk about access to civil affairs, a large part of that, the reserves, and how to explain to senior leaders the importance of doing these overseas deployment training exercises, balancing that operational strategic civil affairs versus it's so important to be tactically proficient, but we do 24 civil affairs, does 24 conventional combat training center rotations between NTC, JMC, and NTC, and I think JRTC, I think I said all of them. That's 32 civil affairs folks in a company going rotation after rotation. How important is it, as you were kind of alluded to get forward, build those relationships? How can we express that to senior leaders who seem focused on this individual readiness? And of course, basic soldier skills and flu shots and cleaning up evals to get the right people promoted are so important. How do we balance all of that? Thank you, sir.
All right, Chris. A great combination of questions. Let me see if I can make a run at a few of them. We found, and with your help, and certainly carried on by Isaac Johnson, who I know is on the net today as well, that we were not structured properly in Korea, even though we'd been in armistice for a long time at that point in time and had rehearsed war plans over and over and over again, year after year, month after month. We still weren't postured for what civil affairs could do in stabilizing the Korean Peninsula in the wake of combat. Okay, and I want to make that point, that it's in the wake of combat. It's not after the wake has met the shores and everything is now placid that you introduce civil affairs. That's what's unique about military civic action. It happens in the wake of combat action, right there behind it. and must be applied then and continuously. And indeed, it becomes the new creative or wake. So you have the wake of destruction that happens in combat. But right behind it can be the wake of military civic action that creates a sense of normalcy. Really important. The bigger the separation between those two wakes, the greater the danger of creating a consolidation of gains and instability following combat action versus stability following combat action. The good news was the Republic of Korea was relatively well configured. Certainly among all allies that I've encountered, it was the best configured. And they'd been thinking their way through a stability command. But the connection between the stability command and the combined force was very limited. It would be the combined force that was creating the combined forces command, creating that front wake, the wake of combat, because that's the warfighter. And the stability command was really to be retained under the control of the chairman of the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff for rear area stability, not front area stability. It's a completely different mindset about what military civic action can and should do. And oh, by the way, that mission in the rear area had to happen also, because South Korea would be affected by war and needed to stabilize itself in the aftermath of war. But it's the front end. It's the part that's advancing further and further into North Korea in this particular case that has to create conditions of stability. Well, how do you organize for that? So the C9 structure was created at the Combined Forces Command, and we expanded it, gave it increased authority, connected it to the Stability Command, and connected it to the 351. And in hopes of, this was, of course, where you sit, the stand depends on where you sit. When I was the USARPAC commander, I didn't want anybody trying to take ownership of the 351, except for me. I wanted to commit parts of the 351 throughout the region because I had a lot of countries to attend to. And I resisted Korea being able to take it over. But as the commander in Korea, I had a different view and wanted all of the 351 committed to me if I could, knowing that that wouldn't happen. Hopefully that would be balanced with the other exigencies of the region. But certainly I wanted the 351 to be heavily committed in my direction. So planning for that, what would be committed? At what point would it be committed? Where would it be committed? For what purposes would it be committed? That required a Civil Affairs Command headquarters thinking through that in partnership with the C9. The tabletops that you talked about, Chris, I think were really important because they were introductory in relationship building. The team was not connected. And the tabletops made it possible for the teams to connect. You mentioned the exchange of business cards there in Korea. That's all good. If you can help to convene a team, then that's a contribution that you and your teammates made. That's an effect of civil affairs, all right? You had that effect by recognizing there was a deficiency in the connectedness of the players who would be needed to stabilize the Korean Peninsula, and you convened those players, and a different network emerged as a result. That's great, and especially that it happened before war. This has to be done in every region. 353 has to do that throughout Africa. With Africa Command, with JTFs that might be committed, or ones that are already committed, like in the Horn of Africa. How is that done? Not looking for general war in the African continent, but that there can always be conditions where the effects of war in regional areas, like the Sahel right now, can destabilize the entirety of the continent and impact our interests in a different way. Is 353 involved in the planning with AFRICOM right now? I don't know. I'm not close enough to it to say that, but you should know as civil affairs leaders, present and past. And that conversation needs to be ongoing, which gets to the how do you address the readiness challenges? Well, this is a hard problem. It is partly a function of the componency that so much structure is in the Army Reserve, and therefore the appropriate controls of how readiness is generated in the Army Reserve apply. If we configured differently, if we structured differently and had a foot, let's call it 1 foot out of the body, set in the active domain, component structure and utilization, but it is a subordinate foot of the Civil Affairs Command, with regional alignment at a minimum, if not outright combatant command, which should be the objective. then you have a portion, I would submit to you, that ought to be a brigade that's committed to each one of the regions for conventional forces, not for SOF. We can still commit civil affairs battalions and sub-teams that come out of it to the SOF elements, but it does mean a migration that more foot is being pushed into the active component, but generated by the Civil Affairs Command, but not under Army Reserve rules for readiness, under AC rules for readiness. The second part is that extension that comes from the foot to the knee and the hip, where you're really starting to now get into the CA command, is on committing for rotational purposes elements of the Civil Affairs Command. That keeps a foot in the door, that keeps regional understanding, that makes convening possible, like Chris Stockel just talked about, in different countries where there may be a need for military civic action, either for competition or conflict. It gets a foot, or it gets more of the body into the door of the Civil Affairs Command. What am I talking about? CAPTs that are committed twice a year into a given region, and they hit 2 different countries while they're out. That's all that has to be generated. You don't have to generate the entire CA command. Generate 2 CPTs a year from the Army Reserve into utilization. Are those the ones that get the training experience at the Combat Training Center? Yeah, they should be. So for each geographic combatant command, 2 of those dozens of CTC rotations should be generational for putting someone into action. This is what we did with Pacific Pathways, for example. The CTC is not an end point, it's an entry point into commitment into a combatant command AOR. So if we change the structure and we change the way we commit active and reserve CA units in competition, then we create a different kind of readiness, the actual understanding of the environment, the creation of relationships, the knowledge of the physicalities of the environment, what projects are going to be needed. You can create a project list in advance in any country. That is readiness, in my view, and that's a step beyond the CTC-oriented readiness. I know we've got some, some current and former senior leaders on the net right now. I see Steve Hashem on there, and Gary Beard, and others that I serve with, and Isaac Johnson, and there are many more. You need to carry this conversation about how you want to see the civil affairs structured and how readiness can be generated in a more comprehensive way. And then people like me, retired generals who were commanders in the field and active generals who are commanding the field, need to be more thoughtful about how they carry conversation with headquarters USARC, with Army Forces Command, with the Chief of Staff of the Army, on how to better generate the capabilities into the field and into the hands of combatant commanders, because that's what matters. Okay, that's a long answer to that quadruple question there, Chris.
Yes, sir. You know me, when sometimes you say, Chris, you only got one question, I gotta, it's like a quad chart. It's only one slide, but it's more than one slide. Hey, sir, I have a lot of things about pathways and stuff like that, but I'm going to turn it over to 2 awesome civil affairs officers that are now Army strategists. So James and Arnell, if you have one question each for the general, then we'll turn it over to the members and folks that have dialed in for, about 25 minutes of Q&A. So over to Arnell and James. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Absolute honor to be able to talk to you and ask you questions. Sir, so from your role as both an ASCC and a sub-unified commander, you had alluded to the spectrum or the continuum of competition that is now being codified in joint doctrine and is trickling its way down into JP30 and now eventually down to the Army. I have a 2-part question for you, sir, in your role as a strategic leader and theater Army leader. How did you see CAO and or CMO, civil affairs operations or civil military operations, enable your commands to achieve U.S. strategic objectives through the 3 different elements of the competition continuum, being cooperation, competition below levels of armed conflict, and armed conflict? How did CAO and CMO, as you as a leader, able to enable and achieve those competition goals? And my follow-up to that, sir, is we've seen recently in the last 4 years an emphasis on platform-based development to support large-scale ground combat operations. With that being said, it has reestablished a comparative military advantage and reestablished deterrence. How does the Civil Affairs Regiment articulate the importance to the other elements of the competition continuum, being the fact that they are the enemy's most likely and most ongoing course of action, to re-emphasize some of those things like the IW Annex recently did. Thank you very much, sir, for taking my question.
All right, James, that's a great combination of questions there. I found first that there is utilization in each one of these different aspects: cooperation, competition, conflict, and I would add post-conflict, which is not the same as the other three. Right? So perhaps there ought to be one more consideration in there, but we can make it a continuation of conflict if you wish. And that is thinking about how do you utilize capability in those points in time? When do you surge it? One could imagine the traditional approach is that we're light in competition, we're episodic in cooperation, we're late in combat or conflict, and then we try to consolidate gains in all the above. I don't think that's a good recipe. I would submit to you we need to be active in cooperation. That means we're moving around, touching different countries, which gives you what I used to call in Pacific Pathways rehearsals, reconnaissance, relationships, and readiness. It's the 3 R's plus 1. Rehearsals, reconnaissance, relationships, and readiness. That happens in cooperation. So that shouldn't be a small part where you have a tasker to send out some sort of civil affairs element to go participate in an exercise. That should be a specific part of a combatant commander's theater engagement design. And it happens with cooperation with other nations. That impacts then the second category, which is of competition. All right, if you're out doing something, not just meeting for a theoretical, go build something, go establish something, go teach something, go generate a capability in another force. Do something that has a residual that can build something of a fire break around countries that are in the zone of competition. So I think about Southeast Asia as a zone of competition. Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, further down into Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, if you want to go all the way down into Southeast Asia. They're in the competitive space in the great power competition between the United States and China. And China has a very long history and in almost every case, an associated border with these countries. But they're not doing it by, advancing Chinese People's Liberation Army tanks into these countries. They're doing it by advancing port building, airport facilities, road infrastructure, water projects. And it's being done by structures that are connected to the People's Liberation Army. Folks, that's civil military operations being done right now. That's their form of competition. And they back it with financing that creates a debt structure that countries now find themselves in leverage to the People's Republic of China. Where on earth is the United States in this? Not close enough. So cooperation creates a fire break that is part of competition. And then deliberately committing to action to develop infrastructure, to develop relationships, and using sometimes military capability to do that. It can be partnered with other instruments of the US government, economic, commercial instruments. That requires a different approach to national security also, that you need the iterations of working with this. Now, in some cases, we get it by serendipity, as one of the questions talks about, military government specialists that are in the civil affairs. There are water, oil, and gas experts who are in civil affairs. All these things are already in civil affairs. And if we're mindful about that, maybe we're going to get it deliberately as opposed to just by serendipity, where somebody happens to work for an oil company that's abroad and get some experience in the oil infrastructure of a given region. Can we be more deliberate about that? I think so, but it requires us to think differently about how to use civil affairs now. So surging it in those first two stages, not waiting for surging in the combat and post-conflict environments, okay, which also will require a surge because of the effects of war that I've talked about and the closeness between the front trace of the wake and the trailing wake. I've already addressed that. So there's a need in all of these. How have I seen it manifest? Because you did ask the question, how have I seen it? I saw it in how we were engaging in parts of the Middle East and some of the countries of the Middle East. I saw it as we joined civil affairs elements with Pacific Pathways or with the Navy's excursion that would tend to happen down into Oceania each year with stops along the way. And we connected U.S. Army civil affairs units to the U.S. Navy to do that work. The combatant commander loved it. So did the fleet commander. It enhanced their program. And sometimes they're medical specialists, sometimes they're water specialists, but it was some capability that was introduced inside of there. And they left residuals along the way. Had to be short-term projects, obviously, but there were residuals that were along the way. That's a fire break that was built in there. I saw that happen. It works. The hard part was getting more of it and getting a higher production rate from that. And then certainly in conflict and post-conflict, I have lots of experiences on that. The most notable is in Baghdad, where I was the deputy commander of the multinational division Baghdad in the heart of the surge. And I valued the brigades that were committed to us. We had, I think, up to one point in time, 9 different brigade combat teams fighting underneath of one division headquarters. It's the largest division that had ever been fielded in the history of the United States military. But we also had the main effort for civil affairs being committed to us, and that's what I was really concentrated on. So I was the deputy commanding general for support, and I concentrated on rebuilding the efforts, and this is where I got this idea of the 2 wakes being close to one another. So the clear, hold, build idea had to be manifested into real commitment of force, and it meant that civil affairs units needed to be exposed to danger, and that is what makes them unique. So civil affairs units had the ability to fight themselves, and in several cases they did fight and kill somebody that was trying to stop them from delivering a project that was going to deliver some normalcy in the area where they were working. Or they were joined with a conventional unit that killed somebody to make sure that they wouldn't stand in the way of it. They were very different from a provincial reconstruction team, which at the threat of danger necessarily withdrew, or from the Agency for International Development that had to be very, very invisible and work through locals in order to get their work done. It was a very different approach and necessary to stabilize Baghdad. And it was through these actions, not just the traditional military actions of clearing out mahalas, it was rebuilding water and sewage and electricity and providing microgeneration plants and water, wastewater treatment, facultative ponds, all those things that I learned from civil affairs people. I never thought I would know that much, but that's who I was out there with. Big impact. That's what helped us to achieve the gains that drove violence down, that caused militias to begin to disintegrate because they weren't providing an alternative to government, and caused extremist groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq to begin to lose their footing. It was through those things, because each one of those groups was trying to create a surrogate for government. And they were doing things to undermine the government directly, physical attacks, assassinations, etc. If you don't have civil affairs, you cannot consolidate gains. You cannot create conditions of stability, and they have to be committed early and heavily. So my point here, I guess, is in all 3 of these, there has to be that. Now, to your point about the platform-based development for essentially building a comparative military advantage, I believe that civil affairs is part of our comparative military advantage. That's a weird thing for an infantryman to say. It should be, give me more bayonets and more ammunition. That's my comparative advantage, because I got killers who are better than you. And so I need more bullets because, you got more people. I'm going to kill a lot more than you kill of me, and therefore give me more bullets and bayonets. Well, that's true too. But I want to have fewer needs to have the mass killings being done by our great warriors out there. I want to give them other advantages. I want to engage in Sun Tzu types of actions where we win without fighting in some places, as well as we win decisively when we find ourselves in a fight. So the platform base is a part of it, but the structural design of civil affairs and the commitments of military civil affairs units is also part of the competitive advantage, the comparative advantage that we should be seeking. Without that, I think, again, we're leaving cards out of our hand here that could be played at a very important time, like right now. Okay?
Awesome. Arnell, over to you for one, and then we'll hit the Q&A.
Yes, sir. Hey, General, thank you. A lot of great wisdom there, gold dust for us to take away. And there's a lot of questions coming in. You got people sparked up and interested. So my question is just rather simple. We were having a discussion earlier about the things the Army just announced recently, the going away of the Asymmetric Warfare Group and the Red Teaming University, the University of Foreign Military and Cultural Studies. I'm sure you're familiar with those both, sir. I mean, that's telegraphing what we care about. And, those things were developed in terms of, having a competitive edge. They gave us an intellectual edge while we're, still fighting. And so just get your thoughts on where you think the Army's going, if that's a good thing or not. I mean, many of us benefited from those organizations and institutions helping us, think a bit more critically about the operating environment and how we conduct, operations. So just your thoughts on that, sir.
Thanks, Arnell. I'm not in the positions of leadership, so I don't know what the decisions were behind that and why the trade-offs are made. So they're good people who are in positions, and they had to make a rational decision based on what is facing them now. But I take your point about the signal that it sends, and I believe, in my words, it's a signal that we can potentially move away from recognize the importance of cultural awareness in the operating environment. Because the institutions, the bodies, the organizations you described were very much about helping to leverage cultural awareness into military effort. Thinking about it, a forethought, understanding the operating environment better, being selective appropriately about where you commit the limited resources you have, all these sorts of things. Human terrain teams were also part of this that have since gone the way of the dinosaur. But they were very effective. Now, if you're a give me more bullets and bayonets type of person, you don't see any value in all this stuff. That's lost resources when you're trying to consolidate the resources to create the greatest impacts. So my view is it has to come up somewhere else, because we aren't without the need that those things fulfilled. What we are without is the resources to sustain them. So how do you then reconnect resources with need? That's the question that requires some creative thinking. And that might mean partnerships with institutions or think tanks that are thus inclined. Get outside of the military circle. Let the nation's capacity help you, not just the funded military capacity help you. You may pay a price for getting their services. That's possible. But it's not within the military structure, and therefore is not an operating cost of the Department of Defense. So there are creative ways to address this. And again, this one can be generated by the Civil Affairs Association to say, hey, you just cut off our feed lot here and burn it up. I want to be connected to that feed lot over there, and I need the resources to be able to do that. We accept the decision to stand down these different entities and bodies, but now I need something to replace them. And that means you got to give me some resources to pay for that. It'll be less than the resources of paying for it and operating it. But this is what is needed. So I encourage you to take that on, maybe as something that the association can lay before the senior leadership of the Army and the Department of Defense. This is important. It's duty. It's important to your survival, your effectiveness when committed, and most importantly, to the combatant commands who are going to wish they had a skilled force that was culturally astute when they don't have it. And that's what we're going to end up with. So I'll leave it at that.
It's a great idea, sir. Thank you.
Hey, General Van Roosen, are you able to come up live? Sir, he asked about proponency and when civil affairs, active and reserve, were all under U.S. Army Special Operations Command. And then there was the Rumsfeld Snowflake, the CA Soft, USASOC maintained the 95th Civil Affairs Brigade, which grew out of a battalion. And then we grew the 80 to support the TSOCs. They each get a battalion. And then we have the active grew to support the conventional, the 85th Brigade, which they downsized to the 83rd, which you kind of alluded to. Many good people are making many decisions based upon limited resources. Is there true, in your opinion, did you see a difference? I mean, of course there's a difference, but did at your level, what was the difference between soft CA and conventional CA? Or did you leave that to the TSOCs, or how did you manage all of that, sir? And what do you think of civil affairs as an organization, soft and conventional?
Well, I think we ought to explore deeply why is it in the special operations community. And it's because our origins doctrinally viewed civil affairs as a special operation. So special operations has a different concept now. You know, we think about it as assaulters, because the assaulters have been increased in number and have been heavily utilized, and they need to have civil affairs associated with the work they're doing. But I certainly experienced as a commander in the field at multiple levels, from brigade all the way up to multiple theaters, that the connection between use the term battle space owner, the person that's responsible for continuous engagement of an environment, the connection between that commander and civil affairs is more important than the periodic presence that should be the case for special operations. They should come in for a purpose and then leave. And that's certainly how we see the traditional application in the modern time. That wasn't always the case. It used to be that continuous engagement was done by special forces groups, all right? They were the ones engaging a country over time and building relationships and building its capacity. And they needed a civil affairs component associated with it. So the origins made sense before, but I don't know that they make as much sense now. What did I see as the difference? Because I did have both, sometimes mixed in the same battle space. An oval and a flash and a beret. That was one of the key differences. Now I'm being a little bit facetious about it. The depth of skill sets was always greater in the civil affairs units. The active units have to concentrate on being soldiers all day, every day. And they have some skill sets, but they're not running cities on a day-to-day basis, or running wastewater treatment plants on a day-to-day basis, or leading government structures, or serving in Congress. I see Tulsi Gabbard on the net. That's not where the active units are. And so the ones that are associated with the special operations are providing really a tactical civil affairs capability, not a strategic civil affairs capability. And when you need to do strategic civil affairs effects in a tactical area, you need the Army Reserve. Okay, so that's how I've seen it, and I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, it's super, sir. Hey, so we have Sir Doug Jordan from SOCOM and JSAL. He asked, sir, you stated that not everyone is a true believer. With the shift to great power competition, how can CA highlight its contribution in this new approach? And I'll combine that with the Gary Beard question. Sir, Gary Beard here, what are your thoughts about civil affairs? Of course, my screen just moved here. Long-term contributions that they can counter China's influence in Asia. Sure.
Well, I'll start with Gary's, and I think I've alluded to it. I believe that it's a very important part of what is committed in cooperation and in competition. And obviously, if we get into conflict in the areas where conflict has occurred, there's a need there for conflict and post-conflict. China's maneuvering now, we have to maneuver as well, and we need something additional. Now, an argument can be made, and I acknowledge this, that why does that need to come from the military? Well, it doesn't have to come from the military, but you have a structure that exists for this purpose in the military, and if it is selectively committed in partnership with other instruments of national power, you know, and I would submit to you that development could actually be an instrument of national power. It's not listed doctrinally as such, but development probably is. China is certainly demonstrating that development is an instrument of Chinese national power. We ought to be thinking about that. So who is it that does development? Well, let's look across the US government. I won't walk it all down. I'll simply say that it's atrophied and under-resourced. And that I can be confident in saying. So our government is not postured for this particular aspect of engaging the environment. And as a result, it's not well postured for competition. So Gary, that's how I'm going to leave it. I think we've got to look much more deeply and much more strategically at this. Now, Chris, the first half of the question came from whom?
Sir, that was Doug Jordan, SOCOM, specifically JSOW. He might have coordinated a couple of your speeches supporting JSOW.
Yeah. Well, and where do you want the question to go? Because my note is not sufficient on what the question was. So refresh me, please.
So that was just about the great power competition. Also, that's why
Okay.
I kind of combined them. You talked about it. You're a true believer. How can CA highlight that contribution? We talked about it a little. I just wanted to.
Yeah. Okay. So just to add a little bit more to that, a bottom-up communication of what civil affairs can do in each one of the phases, or if you will, each one of the categories of engagement with a region or with an adversary: cooperation, competition, conflict, post-conflict. Civil affairs has to advocate for itself. Trust me, that's how I learned about it. It wasn't because I was an expert in civil affairs. It's because I encountered experts in civil affairs who said, hey, we have the capacity to do this and this and this and this. And, why don't you engage us in that or commit us this way? So my practice with military civic action came from the experienced practitioners. And my job was to fuse it together. I believe that's an important way to try to address this. It's bottom up. The civil affairs needs to advocate for itself and what it can do. Talk to the Army service component commanders as your primary connector, and thus to the combatant commands. That's a different conversation than a conversation within CA command or within the U.S. Army or U.S. Marine Corps structures where it exists. Let me just leave it at that.
Copy, sir. James, I think you have a couple questions queued up.
Yes, sir. So first off, we have a really interesting question, sir, about the information domain. You alluded to smart power and the ability of the U.S. to integrate that, and you just touched on some of those with the ability to bring together multiple elements of U.S. power, specifically development and aid. We have a really great question from Kevin Chapla that's asking about your thoughts on where does CA play within the information domain, specifically looking at some of the Chinese and Russian sharp power ability to be able to pierce into democracies and destabilize partners we try to work with. The question would then be, sir, where do you see CA's role, and where does the nation's role in helping develop capabilities in democratic partners without the region to be able to combat the sharp power and influence and information operations from China as they seek to expand their influence and autocratic model? Over.
Well, James, I'd say that first, it's an important part of the information domain. I believe the information domain is indeed that. It is a domain where effects are created, outcomes are achieved, and operations must be deliberately conducted. I do believe that. And I believe that for a long time, certainly from my experience. Often, civil affairs can help to change the narrative that works against U.S. interests. That the U.S. is only interested in X, Y, or Z. It's only interested in its own interests. It's only interested in a monetary exchange. There are many things that are used out there. The U.S. will not be here for you when things go badly. The U.S. is distracted and focused on too many other things. The counter to that is evidence. And civil affairs is a great way to demonstrate evidence of a commitment. Okay, so I'd say it's very important there. It obviously can be woven into deliberate information schemes too, and should be. What do you communicate? But there's a balance though. And I learned this from our colleagues at the Agency for International Development. The military practice of calling attention to the work that's being done to create information effects can cause adversaries to single out those things and destroy them, leaving then a monument to incompletion. or to run away the players who are committed to that change, whether they're AID players or local national players or civil affairs planning teams or provincial reconstruction teams, whatever the entity should be. They can be run away from it. And then again, a creation of a monument to incompletion becomes the information story. So it's very important that we are thoughtful about when we turn the volume up on a particular activity. This is a trade-off, because you do have to compete in the information space, but recognize that there are counterattacks in the information in the space as well that can destroy the work that's been done. So very, very thoughtful approach to a deliberate communication scheme about a given project or a given effort in a particular area. Better to talk about it when it is complete. That was the guidance I gave in Baghdad. Do it, then talk about it. Don't talk about it while you're doing it or before you do it, because all you're doing is putting a target on it. And that happened time after time. So I'll leave it at that point.
Sir, thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Over
Okay.
to Major General Dan Ammerman has a question about a common operating picture. Sir, over to you, Dan.
Good to see you again. My question was, how important was the civil information in your common operating picture? How did you integrate it? And how would you grade our use of civil information and why?
All right, Dan, it's good to see you. And thanks for your
Good to see you,
leadership.
sir.
You know, these are your puppies here on this network. So well done.
Thank you.
It was important to me, and particularly as we advanced in phases of operations. It was challenging to build because it was fundamentally analog. We had no way of having a project tell us how far it was in its completion. It had to be analog. It had to be transferred by someone who went out and saw it and then reported on it. That's the hard part about civil affairs. And I think we've got to be thoughtful in advance about what kind of information are we looking for? How do we gather it? How do we display it? And what does it mean? Eventually in Baghdad, we had a pretty good common operating picture about what was being done. And it was a project by project, Mohalla by Mohalla level of view. And we could zoom in on certain things on a given day to see where we are. What became important to us from that was to be able to see a project relative to a system of needs. We had been achieving limited effect by a project by project approach to management, as opposed to a system of projects approach to management. Very quick example. What is more important, the lift station or the electricity that powers the lift station? So you can rebuild a lift station, but have no electricity that connects to it because you haven't worked on the grid that leads to it and the power generation units that are associated with it and the downstream effects of where the sewage goes from the lift station. You don't have a system. That's what we were doing. They had great projects going on there, but they were not connected as a system. So when we went to system management, which the information, the common operating picture gave us, we had significantly greater effect. So there has to be a common operating picture of what civil affairs actions, military civic action is and where it's ongoing and what effect it's intended to have and whether it's achieving that effect. And it must be woven into the common operating picture of the operating environment. That's difficult to do, Dan. I don't think we're there yet. You know, I think we end up having to recreate that in every environment where we operate. And perhaps within the CA commands and at Mother CA command, if there's a way to build a template for that that is in use in the service component commands and in the combatant commands on a continuous basis as they engage the region, then there'll be rehearsal of that and refinement of that. And it then becomes doctrine. So I'd submit that that's a way to try to get at this. It was important, but we're not good enough yet.
Got it.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Dan. Hey, sir, I know we got about 60 seconds here. I know there was a last-minute schedule change that we had to move this event from a 90-minute event to a 60-minute event. Obviously, action-packed comments. We didn't get to all the questions. So maybe in about 6+ months or something like that, we can bring you back as part of the Senior Leader Forum, try to get at some of these questions and kind of report to you, you know, what we're doing and because I can't thank you enough that the insight here, the 80, 90 folks that dialed in to hear this from a senior leader was just phenomenal. And of course, it's what you saw and how you articulate to us validates what we're doing and gives us room and objectives to improve for. So I'll turn it over to you for the last 30 seconds, sir. And we'll stick around for a couple of minutes if anyone else wants to post any questions, and we'll capture that. Sir, over to you for 30 seconds, closing comments. Thanks
All right,
again.
Chris. Well, thanks once again for the opportunity and to the association for grasping some of these problems. I encourage you to carry on the conversation. I just threw a few grenades here, but you're the ones who have to maneuver on it. So I encourage you to do that. Keep having the conversation and don't forget the bottom-up refinement. But good luck to you. God bless all of you. Thanks for your service, your double duty that you do. And I appreciate it. And I think you are a national treasure. So all the best to you. And God bless.